there is a near-term aspect to the prophecy. That is, the people that were reading the prophecy and reading the scripture would embrace it within their lifetime because there would be a near partial fulfillment. Someone that would hit the scene, that would be someone who fit partially with whatever was prophesied, whatever was promised by God. They could look for it with some amount of expectation because it was going to come within a generation or so. So we could look for a real king to hit the scene. No problem with that. But that's only a partial fulfillment. What we would then do is allow for what's known as the far-term prophecy to kick in somewhere down the road. And that might be beyond our lifetime. That might be centuries later. That might be decades later. We don't know when for sure, but we know that this is the case because there are a good number of prophecies that were fulfilled in this fashion. They took place in the near scope, in the near term. They were fulfilled in a partial manner, and then there were details of the prophecy that did not take place historically. Even now, some of them took a little longer, and then they kicked in, but there are some parts of Old Testament and New Testament prophecy that have not yet been fulfilled yet. And yet, if God's word is to be true and must come to pass because God said it's going to happen, and we do believe that it will, then there must be a far-term fulfillment. So what we're looking at is a earthly king that would come and fulfill this Davidic spot, sitting on David's king, and Israel would embrace him as this messianic figure. But there would be a far-term fulfillment that must be Messiah Jesus. So where does biblical Unitarian fit in? Who do they embrace? Well, guess what? They actually believe this is a messianic passage. They do believe it's pointing to Jesus. They just don't believe that he needs to be exalted and the incarnated God on earth in order to fulfill this passage. So from their perspective, he is an earthly king, but he hasn't fulfilled everything given in the passage yet. At least I believe they don't embrace that he has fulfilled it. I mean, surely they're looking for a Messiah that's going to come again and sit on his father David's throne, because he didn't do that at his first coming, right? Am I right, Biblical Unitarian? That's a good time for you guys to say yes. He hasn't sat on his father's throne, at least physically yet. Maybe in the spiritual heavenlies, right? He's sitting on the right hand of God, which is kind of the same place where David saw him sitting when he said, "The Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet," right? And that we read about in Psalm 110. So yes, we know that there are prophecies that must be fulfilled by King Jesus that will be totally fulfilled when he comes again. So what are we to make of this? Let's read Dr. Brown's notes, and we'll finish our study using Dr. Brown's notes. We're not going to exhaust his notes, but we will use them to the rest of the study. Here's a look just real quick at the books themselves. They are available on Dr. Brown's website, thelineoffire.org. Go to his online products store, or click on the link that says products, I believe, or store, and you can begin to consider buying those products directly from Dr. Brown. He gives them at a great discount. Originally, the 5-volume set would have been at around $125, but he, for at least for this moment, he's got 7 in the set left, not 7 individual books. I believe the set is what he's talking about. At the time of this recording, you can get it on a special deal for $99.99, which is a great deal. I have all 5 books here on my bookshelf, and it was well worth the purchase that I bought them at, the price that I bought them at. So let's turn to one of those books. I can't remember exactly which one it is. I believe it's Messianic Objections. We read this 2 weeks ago. I'm going to back up one paragraph like I always do, get a running start. So we're talking about answering this objection to, is Jesus the Messiah spoken of in Isaiah chapter 9. Remember, rabbinic theology, rabbinic Judaism rejects Jesus as the candidate. So Dr. Brown is arguing for the affirmative that yes, Jesus is the Messiah spoken about in Isaiah chapter 9. And Dr. Brown is also including within his explanation that not just the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, but that this Messiah is an exalted figure. Okay, so he's got to do double duty here. Damage control on two fronts. All right, let's read his notes here. This is what Dr. Brown has to say. He says, on a certain level, And keep in mind, I just read those verses, Isaiah 9, 1 through 7. On a certain level, the meaning of these verses is clear. Great deliverance was about to come to the people of God because the glorious son of David was born. The promised child was here. It was this royal son who would establish the worldwide dominion of the Lord, reigning on the throne of his father David. So when this earthly king hit the scene, Israel had great expectations for this child. But let's keep reading. Putting aside for a moment the name of the child in Isaiah 9:6, which reads in verse 5 in your Jewish versions of the Bible, right? It's not verse 6, but it's verse 9. Franz Delitzsch, which is a Jewish author, he's actually right in stating that this is understandable if Isaiah's contemporaries thought for a time that Hezekiah might indeed be this promised son of David, right? What did I just say? The prophecy was to be understood that it would be an earthly king, but not exclusively an earthly king. In fact, Dr. Brown notes that the Talmud even states that God wanted to make Hezekiah the Messiah and make Sennacherib the Assyrian king, Gog and Magog, but Hezekiah was unworthy. So you can read about that in the Talmud. Dr. Brown continues, in reality, it would seem that his birth was heralded with great excitement and anticipation, with a lofty prophetic oracle of glorious proportions. And Hezekiah was, we acknowledge, mightily used by the Lord, cleansing the temple, restoring the holy days and fast, and experiencing God's supernatural deliverance from the Assyrians, which was part of the prophecy, right? See 2 Kings 18:20, 2 Chronicles 29, chapter 29 to 32. So this is part of the prophecy that we have to acknowledge. I mean, Jesus, let me put it this way. Israel wasn't under the oppression of the Assyrians at the time that Jesus hit the scene. So when we look at the prophecy and it talks about how that, let me go back and show you a part of this, moving backwards into the prophecy, when it talks about in verse, here we go. Starting verse 4, you shall break the yoke of their burden and the staff on their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor as at the battle of Midian. Who is the they? Well, they will be glad in your presence. The people who walk in darkness see a great light. There'll be no more gloom for her. The context is during the time frame of the Judean king that would be a lot earlier than Yeshua. So we can't say that it has to be Jesus just yet. So deliverance from the Assyrian rulership there. Dr. Brown continues, this was quite an impressive resume, but not impressive enough since, number one, look at this. Why was Hezekiah the earthly version, but couldn't be the total fulfillment of the Messianic king? Let's look at some shortcomings according to Dr. Brown. Number one, Hezekiah's reign came nowhere near fulfilling the prophetic word, right? Nowhere near that. Number two, his son Manasseh was the most wicked king in Judah's history. And number three, within 4 generations, the nation was in exile in Babylon. Yeah, doesn't sound like a very potent Messianic king who can't keep Israel out of hot water for very long. I mean, Israel's always been flirting with idolatry and wickedness and flagrant disobedience of God's words and ways, right? Walking in Torah, walking out of Torah, keeping God's temple while at the same time keeping their household idols and their own graven images and representations of false gods. So not a very righteous king that can't keep Israel righteous as a people group. So what are we to make of all of these details? Dr. Brown continues, yet Isaiah declared, right, remember the prophecy, I just read it, quote, of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness. For how long? From that time on and forever. Okay, I got to pause and let that sink in. Did Hezekiah do that? Did he accomplish that? How about his son Manasseh? How about within 4 generations, what happened to Israel? So wicked that God said, you know what? Israel, you guys are so wicked. I'm going to send you into exile. I'm going to let the Assyrians come down and scoop you up and scatter you to the 4 winds. And yet Judah, your wicked sister, she didn't even learn the lesson from her sibling Israel. What did she do? She continued to play the harlot and engage in wickedness and idolatry and all manner of evil and murder. And what did God promise? Well, I'm going to send the Babylonians, and I'm going to scoop you up too. And this time, I'm not even going to spare Jerusalem and the temple. I'm going to allow the Babylonians to capture that thing, carry off all the golden furniture and all the artifacts, and they're going to sack that. They're going to burn it to the ground. Yeah, that's what happened. Yeah, then it did happen, and that's pretty sad. So let's keep reading Dr. Brown. What he has to say is that the only way the famous medieval refutationist Isaac Troche could argue against this idea about Hezekiah not being the one that totally fulfilled was to claim that the words don't really mean what they say. And when we're talking about the kingdom of this Messianic king, the duration of his kingdom being forever, what did Troche say? He writes first that the words without end are a mere figure of speech. And then he continues, this is Dr. Brown's notes, we find similarly in Isaiah 2:7, quote, and his land was full of silver and gold, and there was no end to his treasure, as his land was full of horses, and there was no end to his chariots, end quote. Thus, we also find in Ecclesiastes 4:8, quote, there's one and no second, and he has neither son nor brother, and there is no end to all his troubles, end quote. Then, concerning the promise that through this royal son, the kingdom of David would be established, quote, with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever, Troche states that this expression shows that his dominion, that is the dynasty of David, will never perish. Right? This is according to Troche. And though an interruption occurred during the time of that captivity that I just mentioned about, the government nonetheless will, in the days of the Messiah, return to the Sion, I believe, the Sion of David, meaning the rulership will turn back to David. What does Dr. Brown think about that? Well, let's keep reading. Dr. Brown says neither of Troche's arguments is compelling in the least. Regarding the expression, quote, without end, no end, end quote, the Hebrew of no end, or without end is ein ketz. According to Dr. Brown, it's clear from the examples he cites that these words refer to something that can hardly be counted or measured because it is so vast and boundless, like the riches of Solomon or the troubles of an afflicted man. How then can this prophecy that states of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, how can that possibly apply to Hezekiah? According to Dr. Brown, even granting that the words without end do not have to be taken literally in terms of an eternal kingdom, although this would be a perfectly good way of expressing that concept in Hebrew, according to Dr. Brown, they simply do not describe Hezekiah's reign, which was quite limited in international scope and influence. As for Troche's contention that Isaiah's prophecy need not refer to an uninterrupted reign of David's son, I can only ask in reply, how could Isaiah have been more clearer? Right? We have to think about the way that Isaiah framed the words. And it is true that Isaiah may not have seen the total scope of the prophetic telescoping that he was describing. In fact, often it's likely that the prophets may not have fully grasped the totality of the near and the far, respectively. Often they may have just thought that it was all maybe near or maybe all far, or that a good part of it would be fulfilled partially in the near aspect, and then maybe the rest of it would be fulfilled in another king, but still within the lifetime, perhaps, of the prophetic words being given. We're not exactly sure. We can't know exactly sure for totally until we meet those prophets and are able to ask them, how much of it did you understand? But there are hints of this aspect in the Apostolic Scriptures when it's written about how that the prophets of old peered into their own writings, seeking as to what manner and time when this Messiah would actually hit the scene, because it left them scratching their heads. There are things there are details that are given that just don't seem to be possible for any one particular earthly king. Dr. Brown says, is there no significance to the words from that time on and forever? I mean, do we just make the words empty? Well, I don't think that's the best way to interact with those particular words. And what I'm doing is I'm scrolling and looking at the rest of Dr. Brown's answer and realizing that this is a great place to pause and pick this up next week. We only took a small bite. We're just taking this a little bit at a time. It's a longer answer. And again, you already know the short answer to all of these questions as to whether or not Isaiah 9 speaks of the Messiah or not. Actually, even biblical Unitarian says that it speaks of the Messiah, King Jesus. They embrace that fact. So Baruch Hashem, I applaud their answer on that level. But it would be better if they would just stop wrestling with this idea that Jesus is very God and give in to what the apostolic scriptures already clearly teach. Although it is true, it was a mystery hidden from Israel, but actually now revealed to the writers of the apostolic scriptures. So it is with sadness that I have to recognize that biblical Unitarian, Christian in name, still rejects the incarnation. It's quite sad. So we'll continue working through these, and I'm not ready to throw biblical Unitarian under the bus just yet. As my fellow brothers who are wrestling through these topics or even have come to a decision that Jesus can't be Messiah, let's just give me a listen, right? Hear me out and let me explain my perspective, and perhaps it will give you pause to reconsider your own perspective. But that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.